In the aftermath of a shocking crime, people always ask why. Who would do something like that? Was it about power, money, revenge? Was it done on an impulse or was it planned? What makes these horrific criminals tick? In Wondery's podcast, Killer Psyche, retired FBI criminal profiler Candice DeLong dissects the thoughts and behaviors of the most infamous felons in history. With a career spanning nearly 5 decades, she sat across the table from hundreds of criminals and spent countless hours inside their minds. And you'll definitely want to listen to the episode of Killer Psyche where Candice looks into the shocking case of Mary Beth Rowe Tinning. In 1987, Tinning was arrested and convicted for the murder of her 9th child, Tammy Lynn. A staggering 8 of Tinning's children had died before this one, but their deaths had been deemed genetic tragedies. What would cause a mother to commit such unthinkable crimes? And would Tinning's diagnosis of Munchausen syndrome by proxy get her out of jail? One of the highlights of the show for me was just how knowledgeable Candice is regarding all of the peripheral details to a case. It was really fascinating to get insights into the aspects that, generally speaking, are either overlooked or not really considered in much detail when viewing what is available to the general public. Candice has a lot of experience in her field, and the reflections she provides are really intriguing. It's definitely worth a listen. So, listen to Killer Psyche on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen 1 week early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app.
I may seem out of my mind here. I feel like I am, but I'm gonna share this anyway. So, the first night that I heard it was the end of summer of 2019. I was building my own art studio in the back of this old building, and one night I stepped out onto the back deck to clean up. I was staring off into the woods that ran right up next to the stairs leading up to my studio when I heard something let loose this immense deep howling off in the distance. It had such a blood-curdling effect on the air around me that it gave me goosebumps and raised every hair on my body. And shortly after it just went silent. Then I heard all of the dogs in like a 1 or 2 mile radius barking and yipping and howling in the direction of whatever that was. There was no way that it was a wolf or any sort of a large cat. I've heard videos and sound bites of wild cats, mountain cats making those demonic type sounds, and that was not this. This was a roar of some kind. Almost sounded human too, but mixed with like an animal of some sort. I could hear it in its voice. The area of Ohio that I'm in isn't a place where you would actually see any really large cats, let alone hear any really. And so, I don't know why this popped into my head, but I just thought to myself that it sounds like a Wendigo. And countless of other number of things have been happening more and more lately. Almost like intuition or something in my head. I don't know. Anyway, 4 weeks prior to the weirdest thing that I've ever experienced, I was approached by a man about commissioning 3 art pieces of something that I wasn't really familiar with at all. Wendigos. And more specifically, a wartime Wendigo, where it's this huge 1,000-foot tall creature, taller than a building or a skyscraper, and it's made out of all of us, body parts sticking out all over it, a face here and there, and it was supposed to represent all of our greed and insatiable desire or something like that. Sadly, I didn't have the time to work on these pieces, so I had to pass them up. But it started reminding me of my own sort of monster that's been following me my whole life. I made some drawings of night terrors that I had a week before this man approached me to turn us into the Wendigo, and so yeah, I've always had night terrors and weird dreams like that. In my dream, it was a tall, emaciated creature with animal-like body features, legs, and human-like arms crouching in my kitchen like a dog would sit, looking in my cabinets. I asked it, "Well, what are you doing?" And it said, "Chill out, I'm looking for some chips or something, I'm starving." I know, a bit weird, but I sat up quickly and threw the blanket off of me because that last bit, I actually said it out loud. And it was at this point that I noticed something in my room. It was in the corner. It turned to look at me, and the way it looked was, well, very hard to describe, but I tried to take in every detail that I could. It had large black holes where the eyes were supposed to be, and just a jagged slit across the lower side of its face that represented a mouth with no lips, I think. It had a sort of long tongue sliding out between them, and it let out a sort of gurgled, squelching sort of noise, maybe like a scream. Then all of a sudden there was like these black, smoky, tendril-looking things shooting out of it, where its hair was supposed to be on its head. It lingered for a second, and then it just sort of sucked back in towards its body, and then it just vanished. I sat there dumbfounded, trying to figure out if that was actually real or if it was just sleep paralysis or something. Eventually, I just got up and I didn't sleep much that night. I made drawings of it and was trying to put all the pieces together as to why it was in our kitchen of all places in my dream. And then every hair on my body stood on end because I had an unanswered email still about commissioning some artwork based on it. Anyway, I know it's all very strange and convoluted and a bit confusing, but all of that was to talk about this next thing that happened. So fast forward to June 2020. The world is now in lockdown, and I'm sure that I'm about to lose my mind. I forgot about all of this and am hanging out with a friend, 3 a.m, just after months of not seeing or talking to anyone, it seemed. But we went out to White Castle for a quick bit. She walks out first and hits the bottom step, and as I'm walking out and locking the door, I hear something breaking tree limbs, crashing through them. Not fast too, but slow and definitely noticeable. And it was coming from up high and gradually getting louder as it neared us and as it got lower. It reminded me of an orangutan or a gorilla maybe, the way it swung from each branch, and I could hear its hands gripping each one and snapping smaller limbs in its way. And unfortunately, it seemed to be coming in our direction. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I'm crazy, until she turned around quickly and was looking up high in the trees. She asked me, "Did you hear that?" And at that, I turned white and had felt the air get very heavy all of a sudden from the fear that was emanating from this whole situation. I came down the stairs and she's staring into the trees looking upwards. I glanced and see the branches moving. I yelled at her to get out of here quickly, pulling her towards the direction of the car. We turned our backs to the woods when this loud sort of whacking sound. It landed just behind me, and all of the hairs on my body stood straight up. I felt like it had a log or maybe a large thick branch in its hand or something, and it smacked the ground with it. In any case, I stood paralyzed for a moment with fear. The air was now thicker and different from whatever it was, landing directly behind me. I could feel the air force of it too, and it almost brought tears to my eyes because it was the weirdest feeling to have come over me, and it just felt like it was crushing every inch of my body without even touching me. And it actually hurt a little bit. It made me shake uncontrollably as well, and the fear it made me feel was just too much to bear. Hands down, it was one of the most terrifying things that's ever happened to me, and I couldn't really shake it, but eventually we got in the car and we took off. We went to White Castles like we said we were going to, and we were both just shook. I was in disbelief at what we had just witnessed, and we came back and turned the brights on in her car and let them light up the woods for a good 20 minutes before we felt like it was safe to go back inside. The only weapon that I had in sight, too, was a golf club, and when I picked it up, she told me that she had actually seen it, high in the trees, and that apparently it looked almost like an owl, sort of, with weird features. I've put a lot of pieces together in this story so far, and a few weeks later something else happened at a friend's house one night when we were playing music together. It's something that's made me vow to never step foot in the woods anywhere ever again, but I'll save that part for another time. I just wanted to get some feedback on this particular part of the story, as I've been talking to countless others about their experiences with the woods where they live at and stuff, and reading so many things about all these strange cases. I would like to get your opinion on what you might think all of this is, but anyway, thanks for listening to my story. It's really helped me out. This was a few months ago, and quarantine was already in place, so I spent a lot more time at home and around the home than usual. There's a park very close to my house, so one day I decided to go for a little jog, just to get out and get some fresh air. I ran from my house into the park, and since I don't have the best fitness, I decided to take a little break. I noticed that a guy was looking my way, but I didn't think too much of it, until I started jogging again, and he started walking at the same time. Since I was jogging, I eventually lost him, so I thought that was that. But, man, was I wrong. So, it's been a few hours, and I'm sleeping, when, through the window, I noticed car lights coming back and forth on my street. The window in my room gives a view of my street. Now, I know that some people may think that this is normal, but I live in a very quiet neighborhood, so I wanted to see what was going on. And as I thought, there was a car that was traveling back and forth on my street. Then, the car stops right in front of my house, and that same guy comes out of the passenger seat, which means that there's at least one other person with him. Up until this point, I was still half awake, but the sight of that same guy looking up to my window, seeing me and smiling, that woke me up real quick. I immediately closed the blinds, which are a tiny bit see-through by the way, and I climb in my bed and phone in my hand. After waiting for some time and now thinking that I was stupid, I fell asleep again, only to be woken up by light tapping on my window. Now, remember when I said that my blinds are see-through pretty much? Well, I could make out the silhouette of a man, probably the same guy since there were still car lights in the street, and he was now crouched at my window, tapping from outside. The first thing that came to my mind is not to move and to try to pretend that I'm still asleep, not knowing if he could actually see inside my room or not. And then I remember that my room is on the second floor. So how the heck did he climb onto the little roof area outside of my window? I had absolutely no idea, but I knew that going down was not going to be easy. I slowly pulled the covers over my head and I called the police, whispering and telling them that the guy was still tapping. They told me to slowly get out of reach of the window in case he breaks in or something, and that they would be there in about 5 minutes. I crawled out of bed and into the bathroom where I could see the street behind my house and waited. After a couple of minutes, I heard the knocking stop, then silence, and then a big thump, then more silence, and a knocking at my door downstairs. I was still on the phone with the operator when I heard someone call out that it was the police and that the guy was gone. I told the operator that the police had thankfully arrived, and she told me to wait. There was silence, and she said that the police had not arrived yet, and to not open the door under any circumstances. Soon enough, she tells me that the police are now there, and that I can now go and open the door. I go and check outside of my bedroom window just out of paranoia, and there were in fact 3 police cars and about 5 or 6 officers outside of my house. I go downstairs as one of them is knocking, and I open the door, thank the operator, and hang up. I tell them the whole thing, and they tell me that the guy was already gone when they arrived, but that there was no one there anymore. In the next few days, I saw officers on my street, but I never got any news from the guys. The only thing that they apparently found was a rope and a small knife. No fingerprints, no car, no guy, nothing. Lately, I've been noticing something off about my home. Like, there's something else there with me, my wife, and our 2 dogs. But I haven't been able to put my finger on it. Until today, that is. So, for some context, I live in a duplex. We share the property with another guy in his mid-20s. He has his own house, and we have ours, obviously, but we share the laundry room that leads to our respective backyards that are separated by a fence. So, this all started around maybe 2 months ago when the guy sent me a text. It read, "Hey man, just a heads up, someone stole my bike out of the sunroom." This is extra creepy too, because to get to our sunroom or laundry room, you would need to hop the brick fence surrounded by shrubby trees and then hurl the bike over. Unless the thief had the most massive pair of balls ever and walked out through one of the front doors when we weren't home or something. Either way, I didn't feel right and made more of an effort to keep the door locked. Fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, I let my dogs into the backyard and one of them starts sniffing at the shed. No big deal, the lizards are coming out with the heating up and everything like that. They probably just chased one under the door, right? I finally got them to come in, but didn't give it much thought, and I hardly ever go into that shed anyway. Nothing wrong with it, it's just kind of out of the way, I guess, and I'm not really a hang out in the shed type of guy, if you catch my drift. So, we generally use it for storage, but there's really only suitcases, furniture that doesn't fit or match the house, some camping stuff, I think. Just boring suburban stuff. We probably enter it maybe 3 times a year at most. But after the 18th day in a row of my dogs being curious about the shed, I decided to have a little bit of a look-see to see if maybe there was a Komodo dragon or something in there, since they wouldn't let this thing go. But no Komodo. But what I did find literally scared me half to death. Inside the shed was the bike that my neighbor had stolen a little while back. My first thought was, oh man, my wife is a klepto, but quickly ruled that out. She doesn't even like to bike. Then I was briefly worried that my neighbor thought that I was the thief. I mean, it's in my shed after all. And to be honest, I have no idea how to explain that if he found out. Plus, I wanted to give him his bike back. I kept looking around and found one of our sleeping bags unraveled, but balled up behind a box. Inside of it was what looked like a sack to be around $20 in change in singles. There was also a bag for garbage and had a lot of food wrappers inside. And eventually my brain accepted what it was ultimately denying at first and put 2 and 2 together. Someone, and I don't know who, is living in my shed. Or at least was. Maybe my dog spooked them off, or maybe they sleep around there every other night or something and leave during the day. If they weren't coming back, why would they leave the change like that though? I ended up leaving everything how I found it and thinking about what I should do next. Whoever did it must have gotten in there through the spare set of keys that I keep hidden in my backyard. I locked up though and brought them inside with me tonight, and hopefully whoever it is gets the message and moves on. I'm going to install some cameras tomorrow as well, and I'll keep you guys updated if anything else happens. Please hope for the best and that this person isn't some crazy lunatic who is going to murder me in my sleep. So me and my wife have started to rebuild our relationship after a few weeks of separation due to my temporary job and our son. He's 5. And well, we bought a house that's fairly old because, well, it was nice, cheap, and also near both of our families and jobs. We've had several weird things happen in that house, but kind of just laugh about it now. And so we were just hanging out in the living room when our son just casually turned around at us and asked whose grandpa that was lying in our bed. Me and my wife just sort of looked at each other like, what the? And then looked back at him and asked him to describe, well, what he saw. And he just said that it was an old man. And he asked, who are you? And apparently the old man looked at him and smiled before closing his eyes and going under the covers and disappearing. We immediately got up and pulled out these photographs of some of the men in my family who died, and he said that it wasn't any of them. No one officially died in this house, and the house was empty for a while before we bought it. I asked my neighbor who lived next door for 50-something years and said a while back that there was an older guy who was frequently coming home to visit his daughter and son-in-law who died, but he was black, and my son said that it was a white person. Well, he said the same skin color as him. I'm really confused as to who it could be, but I'm still waiting on my answer at all. I'll make another post about the experiences that we had other times, but the night experience that we had, man, it was terrifying, and it's still bugging me. So, it was July 4th weekend, I remember, because they were still shooting off fireworks outside in the distance when he was in bed and had this massive freakout. He has a little nightlight in his room that pretty much keeps a good amount of light in his room. And well, his room and our room are very close to each other, and me and my wife were just watching TV silently when we heard what sounded like tapping on the window. Well, we thought that it was fireworks, to be honest, and sort of ignored it when we started hearing our son talking, and we both looked at each other, and then we heard, "Who are you?" And then, weirdly enough, "What are you?" And that's when I got up, and I heard the windows opening, and he started screaming, and I ran in and picked him up and brought him downstairs, and my wife then noticed that the window was actually open, and she closed it and followed us, and when he finally calmed down, he asked what was wrong, and he tried telling us, but then kept insisting on drawing it. Basically, what he drew was a black circle, but claimed his eyes were blacker than his whole body, and tried tapping on the window to get in. That's how he explained it anyway. After this, we had our priest come and bless the home, but nothing has happened since then that was malicious, in my opinion anyway. But what do you guys think? So I was 10 years old when I met my best friend. We were pretty much inseparable from the beginning. All through school, we were always by each other's side. Our last names both started with J, so we had almost every class together. He was a really smart kid too, a student. As we grew up and sort of became adults, we had different views on what we wanted to do with our lives. He had his first child at 18 years old, split up with the child's mum, so the thought of college never really set well with him. He worked a 9-to-5 job trying to support himself. By 21, he met another woman and had a baby with her. This time he was doing good and stayed with the woman, taking care of his and her other child, and to be honest, I was proud of him. And all of a sudden, something inside him just flipped. It was almost like a switch, too, overnight. He left that woman, moved to another state, I think, and I haven't spoke to him in about 2 months after that. All of a sudden, late at night, I get a phone call from his mother saying that he was now in jail. I asked what had happened, and she told me, and it was horrible, and he got caught and sent to jail. He was serving 2 years behind bars, but only because of certain circumstances. 2.5 years later, though, he gets out of jail, and I told him that he can stay with me until he gets on his feet. But he chose not to. He stayed with my mum for about a month, and every day I would go and check up on him. I'd be like, "Hey man, what's going on? How are you?" And the answer I always got was, "I'm good, and thanks for helping me out." He called me at one stage and said that he wanted to end everything, and he also had a knife in his room. I drove down there to talk him down and took the knife away. But later that night, I called him and checked up on him, and there was no answer. I called my mum, and she answered and said that he was in his room, and so I said go and look, but he was nowhere to be found. We found out where he went that night. Apparently, he had walked to his ex-girlfriend's house and also was spying on her and her boyfriend. He walked behind the house and had ripped his shirt off and shoved it in the crack of a window and lit the whole house on fire and walked away. Thankfully, the adults in the house were awake. They smelled the fire, and the children and everyone got out safely and called the fire department. But my best friend, he admitted to everything, and he's been in jail since. I guess it just goes to show that no matter how much you know someone, you never truly know them. And that thought is really terrifying. So I have two Australian Shepherds. One is my personal dog and the other is a foster dog. Both are roughly 60 pounds, and I took them on a walk today at a local wilderness area that consists of about maybe 50 miles of trails in total. I've been there many times with just my dog and never had any problems. Anyways, we're walking down this trail and they do a bark at a few people that we see. Every time I see someone, though, we step to the side of the trail and let them pass. I apologize for them. The person smiles and just keeps walking, and we all carry on. So, when I see this one guy approaching, the dogs go into alert mode and we step off so that he could pass. He gets up to us and stops and says, "Oh, I don't think your dogs like me." I told him no, that they're just nervous, and I apologize for them being so loud, and at this point I'm holding them by their harnesses, so they're super close to me, but they're just going crazy, like angry barking, lunging and growling, etc., almost trying to bite this guy. I know that that's not great behavior, but nonetheless, he tells me, "I'm sorry that they don't like me, I'm really sorry." At this point I'm weirded out though, because he has not broken eye contact and seems rather unfazed by the dogs. I again tell him that it's okay, it's not his fault, and I tell the dogs, "Let's go," and begin to guide them away. He then says that he's going to keep moseying up the trail, and I say, "Alright," and I tell him to have a good day, and we walk off in opposite directions. I thought that it was a strange interaction, but hey, we can all be a little weird sometimes, so I didn't think too much of it. About 2 minutes later, though, I hear him call out from behind me, and I turn around and see him approaching. He says, "I just really want to be friends with your dogs. I don't want to leave them on bad terms, and I want to make friends," as he keeps walking up to me. Now, I don't know about other people, but when I come up to nervous dogs, I tend to leave them alone, or if I do try to make friends, I squat down, talk gently to them, and extend a hand, stuff like that. But he never did any of this, and I swear that he never even looked at my dogs, because he kept looking at me the whole time. This time the dogs are going absolutely nuts, but I don't grab their harnesses. I let them have the full length of the leash to put some distance between us and the man. He keeps telling me repeatedly that he just wants to be friends, and I tell him that I don't think that that's going to happen, that they're just not there yet. He does try to approach still, but the dogs have none of that. He eventually says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't think they're going to be friends with me." But again, he isn't even looking at the dogs. So I tell him, no, they're not, and they won't be letting him get any closer. And at that, he finally turns and leaves, and I call my sister for the remainder of the walk. So, is it annoying that my dogs freak out over the mailman, or the neighbors, or a knocking noise on the TV show? Yeah, it is. But I don't know for a fact that this man today had bad intentions, but I'm really glad that they were there and made it abundantly clear that he was not getting near me. I'll probably work with them on calming down a little quicker, but I have no plans to have them befriend strangers at first sight, especially after all of this. Two years ago, I took my wife, my father and son, then three, to visit family in rural New England, America. They live on a small farm with buildings that date back to the 1700s, which have been restored and modernized, and a guest house which was built about 20 years ago. My cousin is a prolific photographer, and my auntie had decorated most of the rooms in the main house and guest houses with her photos. We didn't notice much about the photos in the guest house when we first arrived, probably because we were all just jet-lagged. But the next morning, after a sound night's sleep, we were sitting in the main family room eating breakfast and making plans for the day when I noticed that my son was keeping his head down and not answering my father whenever he spoke to him, which was unusual because even at that young age, they were very close. I looked over to my dad and noticed that he was sitting in front of a photo of a room in a rundown house. The room had a large window with sunlight streaming in, casting shadows across the length of the room towards a dark corner. I got an uneasy feeling from that photo, but didn't think too much more of it. We finished breakfast and all got up from the table, and I noticed my son was walking in a sort of wide arc around the end of the table where my father had been sitting. Again, weird behavior, but I just dismissed it as a weird 3-year-old thing. Over the next day or so, I noticed him becoming more and more uneasy any time that we were at the dining table and doing whatever he could do to avoid looking at that photo. Eventually, I decided to ask him what was wrong, and he answered me very matter-of-factly, "The bad man in the picture is looking at me. He's very cold and he's not nice." I looked back at the picture and got instant chills down my spine because there was no man in the picture, but I got the feeling that there was more to it than an empty room. I decided to ask my cousin about the picture, and she told me that it was taken at an abandoned farm a bit further upstate. It was one of her favorite pictures, but had always given my aunt the creeps, so it was moved into the guest house. Over the next couple of days, whenever I would ask my son about it, he would say things like, "The bad man is looking at me, he doesn't like me, he wants to hurt me," and I didn't think too much of it until we were going to bed one night and my son tripped and fell, seemingly for no reason in the middle of the hall and started crying hysterically. When I asked him if he was okay, he said that the bad man hurt me on the leg. I checked his leg and sure enough, on the side of his leg there was a large bruise that looked like he had been struck with a blunt object. And there was just no way that falling over like that would have given him a bruise that bad, that quickly. I didn't want to play into his fears or anything, but I asked him how the bad man could hurt him if he was in the photo downstairs near the table. And his answer was enough for me to pack up all of our stuff and move to the main house with my aunt, uncle, cousins, and big burly housekeeper pretty much right away. He said, "He's not down there. He comes up here when we go to bed." We left soon after that, so I never found out anything more about the farm where the photo was taken, but I'm sure that there was some kind of evil presence around it. Have any of you guys ever experienced something similar? If you have, then please share with me, because this was definitely one of the creepiest things that I've ever had happen to us.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Chime a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, have you ever received an overdraft fee unexpectedly? I know I have, and it really feels like I was being taken advantage of. I hate how this happens when you least expect it to. Like when you're just withdrawing some cash that you expect to be in your account because you should be paid your week's wage by that point, only to find out that you haven't been paid yet. And so, you've overdrawn. I've been there, and it really felt like I was scammed out of my hard-earned dollars. Well, kick off 2022 with a better checking account, with no monthly fees. Chime, an award-winning app and debit card, has no overdraft fees, foreign transaction fees, monthly fees, or service fees. With over 60,000 fee-free in-network ATMs at many locations like most Walgreens, 7-Elevens, CVS, you can access your money when you need it, where you need it. You can also send money to anyone, even if they aren't on Chime, fee-free for you and no cash-out fees for them. Make your first good decision of the new year and join over 10 million people using Chime. Sign up takes only 2 minutes and doesn't affect your credit score. Get started at chime.com/be scared. That's chime.com/be scared. And in the spirit of transparency, just know that banking services are provided by and debit cards are issued by the Bancorp Bank or Stride Bank NA members FDIC. Get fee-free transactions at any MoneyPass ATM, in a 7-Eleven location, and at any Allpoint or Visa Plus Alliance ATM. Otherwise, out-of-network ATM withdrawal fees may apply. Also, sometimes Pay Anyone instant transfers can be delayed, and the recipient must use a valid debit card or be a Chime member to claim funds.
This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I'm 21 now, and it's never left me. I think about it constantly and ponder over what happened. My grandfather passed close to a year ago in June of 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues in my family. They don't really pertain to the story, but there are some things about him that I have to share in order to explain the story in the best way. So, my grandfather, John, was a man who was extremely calloused and old-fashioned. He was bitter, abusive, and a complete macho man. My mother was raised on never showing emotion or pain due to his abuse and lack of compassion for others. He was also an extreme racist. He had many secrets in my family that are now coming to light after his death. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because, well, he had more important things to do, like drinking and having affairs. Just an overall intense and very nonsense type of man, though. He also was not religious at all and found things like faith and hope pretty stupid. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely early to mid-70s. My mum was born in 1965 and remembers this story clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year it was. Anyway, one summer day, John decided to take his family on a small outing with the intent to have a picnic in the woods. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother and my grandmother were all there and were very excited about this. Where we are from, my family is more than accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for, well, generations, I think. Going into the woods for a fun family activity was pretty much nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down a dirt backwoods road and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around as kids do, after being stuck together like that, my grandmother began unloading their food and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up, and as he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eye. But before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said that he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother thought not much of it, since they're all used to the woods and these woods in particular were very familiar to them. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff that they'd brought with them. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. This mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be any animal in these woods, and there was nothing but squirrels and raccoons in the area. But scattered amongst the mound were larger river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it, but the mood immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and also worried about it, but she did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry, I guess you could call it, and just continued playing while avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a beat, I guess. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view from anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange, though. It was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with a rope and hung high above their heads. Now, a lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but someone had to have placed that noose there. My grandmother stopped pretty much dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. They couldn't just pick up and leave. John was still out in the woods after all. But even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become very anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had now completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman that she is, soothed her children and told them that it was just left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart that they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it like that. At least, sane deer hunter, that is. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they began to really panic. My grandmother, as well as all the children, began hearing a sort of rhythmic chanting from deep in the woods. It sounded as though there was a group of people, all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went with a sort of quick pattern, 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away, but immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volume. It was not just getting louder, though. It was definitely getting closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate in their chest. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves, surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go, get in the car," he yelled. He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave now. They had never seen terror on this man as they had at this moment, too. He was a man afraid of pretty much nothing, unbothered by the world around him. This was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything back in the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother picked up their things and, as quickly as possible, threw it all in the car. They had no care for the things that they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk and items were broken, and after everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and they drove away. And this is where the main grunt of the story ends, unfortunately. But one fact from this story is what really has caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has just refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children or my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he just quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them to not ask again. He never went to the police or told someone outside of the family. My grandfather is really the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself that I would ask him one day. And now I can't, and regret it greatly. By the time that I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him outside of occasional happy birthday calls or letters. And this story just doesn't have any answers to go with it. When he died, the only thing that I was sad about was never really knowing what happened that day. What I mean is that we weren't close at all when I got older, and once I'd learned about all of the abuse that he caused, I chose to separate myself from him. His death, though, it looms over me, and this story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood, nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I am one of the only people in the family who is still curious about what happened. I've always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror, and conspiracy theories. This story, it definitely piqued my interest more than any others in my family. which, by the way, this isn't the only strange story from my family, but it's definitely the most strange. In the end, I guess I just wish I had answers, and I hope all of you found this story as fascinating as I did. My girlfriend and I, we wake up at the same time and call each other over Snapchat video, the call service, every morning. We both take virtual classes, so it's a fun way to start our mornings. This morning, shortly after we'd both woken up, she fell back asleep. I placed my phone on my desk this morning and then left to make some coffee and breakfast. When I returned, she had hung up the call and had sent me multiple messages with sad faces in my name. I noticed that she had tried to call me multiple times with the video features turned off. I called her back with my video on, and she was crying and asking me what I was doing. I explained to her that I went to go and make breakfast. She asked me if I had come back at any time, to which I told her that I hadn't. When I told her this, she began crying even harder though. I was very confused. I did my best to console her while trying to understand what was making her so upset. She made me promise her multiple times that I hadn't come into the room while I was making breakfast, and I told her that I hadn't. She then began explaining to me that she saw me standing in the room. She saw me facing the phone a few feet away from it, staring into the camera. She was confused for a few seconds, but she told me that she knew something was wrong after a while. She told me that my eyes were unnaturally wide and unblinking. She thought the camera had frozen, but she said that she could see my body moving slightly and my arms swaying. She was deeply disturbed, obviously, and hung up after about 30 seconds. I was very taken aback by this. I mean, I've had absolutely no paranormal experience in this house. I've lived here for more than 6 years, too. The only thing that I can think of that may have incited some type of paranormal activity would be something that happened on my property like decades ago. My property used to have an attached barn, and one of the previous owners had ended his life in that barn. Like I said, I've never experienced anything paranormal in this house though, so I have no idea what's going on. I've also considered the possibility that she may have just had a nightmare, but she seemed so confident that she was awake. I'm really not sure what to make of all of this. I don't feel comfortable sitting in this room, the one where she saw the dark copy of me. It feels just how it did before though. If anybody could shine some light on what just happened or provide a possible explanation, then I would greatly appreciate it, because this whole situation's got me pretty messed up. So, I have to keep this general, but I would really like to share it. Also, before I begin, please keep in mind that I was 22 years old and not even out of grad school when all of this went down. I'm a therapist, and while I was in grad school, I began an internship that provided group and individual counseling to halfway houses. This halfway house was run by a church and their well-meaning congregation, but was a bit of a mess. After several months of working with them, I got a phone call from the house parent that said none of the residents were willing to attend group sessions if their new housemate would be involved. The house parent made some comments about typical house drama, so I wasn't too worried about it, and just told them to go ahead and bring the residents to the clinic, and I would work with the new housemate privately to figure out what was going on. I met with the new housemate first, and they seemed a bit reserved and untrusting, but nice enough. When I asked about the issues in the house, they gave a small curved smile and raspy sort of chuckle or scoff. I pushed them a bit further, but all they said was that the others were scared. We ended our session agreeing to meet weekly. I had the group session next, new housemate not included, to get a feel with what was going on from the others. When I walked in, I could tell that there was something seriously wrong. Their faces looked terrified. Their general appearances were disheveled, and they were all looking anxiously around at each other. I asked what was going on, and nobody answered. They asked me what I thought of the new housemate, and I redirected back to them. The anxious eye contact continued. I asked again and reminded them that change and growth couldn't occur without honesty. And finally, one of them started talking. And here is the story from that perspective. Well, we were told that we were getting a new housemate that we weren't supposed to have much interaction with, and that they wouldn't be there long. No one would give us info about why the new housemate would be getting the only private bedroom, or why they wouldn't be participating in classes or group activities. They just told us to leave them be. This must have gone on for 2 weeks, I think. Then they started letting the new housemate hang out and participate in things. And they would make some strange comments that would make us uncomfortable, but we would just ignore them. They wouldn't sleep. They would always leave their bedroom after they thought everyone was asleep, go into our rooms and check to see if we were actually asleep by holding their finger under our nose. Then they would leave and walk through the backwoods. They would always be back in the morning, and we would tell the house parent, but would be told to be quiet and not talk about this with anyone. One night after dinner, we turned on the ID channel, and new housemate was watching with us. And a few minutes into the episode, and they got up and walked into the woods. We usually did this super late at night, but anyway, a few minutes later, we heard it. Their name in the episode. We couldn't be sure, so we went to the computer and checked and saw that they had tortured and murdered several people. Now, there's more details to the story that I can't share, but needless to say, my new client was a convicted serial killer that had done some very horrible things. This person was being let out on a technicality that affected several of the murders that they were charged with, so got released early on the condition that they lived under supervision. And this particular halfway house was being paid to hold this person until a more appropriate structure was in place. After I had done my research and confirmed myself, I went to my supervisor and professor, and the contract with that particular church and halfway house was immediately terminated. Icing on the cake, though, the next year of my life was just terrible, as I was stalked, my home was invaded, my dog's injured, my house and car vandalized, and survival items that didn't belong to me were found in my attic that made it look like someone had been living there. I would come home and the house would look different than the way that I left it. The police came to my house over a dozen times through that year and did nothing, so my family hired a security team and installed cameras. 6 months later, a perpetrator was arrested on my property, and eyewitnesses and evidence linked him to the crimes. The perpetrator had been out of prison for just over a year on some terrible charges, and you can probably guess who was from the same small hometown as the man arrested. Yep, it was my client. My family is from Guatemala. My parents grew up in a town close to the pyramids of Tikal in a very mountainous area. In 1976, my parents, being around 10 and 12 years old, there was a horrible earthquake that killed and injured hundreds of thousands of people. My dad was even trapped for days under the rubble of his home before being rescued. It's just a horrible memory for them. I have many family members with similar stories. That isn't the paranormal tale, though, but events leading to it, they definitely were. But this is the story as told to me by my parents. So about a year, or maybe a little more later, strange things started to happen in the forestry mountains near their town. It started with the cries, as they call it. Every night, someone would stay crying in the mountains. At first, they thought it was possibly a wild cat in heat. However, they started to realize that this sound could be heard from everywhere in the town. My mum said it sounded like a man wailing in pain or anguish. It happened every night around the same time, and it lasted sometimes for hours on end. And it was only a few months later when the sighting started. It started with a large bird flying over the town and mountains. Then a large humanoid creature was seen in the mountains. My mum described it as kind of like Bigfoot, only it was completely white and less hairy. The people who crossed its path said that its eyes were very pale, and the noise that they heard at night sounded the same as the cry that it would emit when spotted, an anguished, horrified sound. Almost exactly a year after the first sound started, the earthquakes hit, and my parents' town, being close to the epicenter, suffered great damages. Like I said, many people died, were injured, or became homeless. But after that, the wails completely stopped. My mum often ponders if it was some sort of an angel coming to warn of the coming disaster and that it left having been unable to be understood. My dad believes that whatever it was probably died, just like many others, falling victim to the earthquake. So, to set some facts down, I was an exchange student. I'm small and built, and I live in an apartment on my own. I'm also an extremely heavy sleeper, meaning that my neighbours would blast loud music, and my other neighbours have had their loud TV right behind my bed, but I never woke up because of the noise. I originally come from a big city, not too crowded, but pretty big. It's always been safe in my city to pretty much everyone. You rarely hear about break-ins, even though it's always busy. However, in the States, I lived in a really small town. A college town, basically. Very quiet and sleepy all the time. The area where my apartment was located wasn't the fanciest in town by any means, but also wasn't the sketchiest too. And to be honest, I have never feared for my safety in there. Until that day. So I needed a nap, and it dragged out longer than I intended it to, so I woke up around late sunset. But towards the end of my nap, for some reason, and remember I'm a very heavy sleeper, I was half asleep and sort of half awake. It was getting darker already outside, so there was not much light to alarm me of the time. If anything, I was closer to being asleep than awake, I think. I kept hearing sounds from the wall where my apartment door is, though, which also happens to be the same side of the walls where my bed and the window are. In the beginning, being me, I thought that I was just dreaming. I was still sort of half awake, and I thought it was one of my neighbors doing something. But then the scratching noise kept going for about a minute. This is when I became fully awake, and I sat on my bed and paid attention and quickly realized that this scratching noise was someone outside of my door. I gathered every single bit of courage that I could and walked closer to the door. Thinking about it now, I probably shouldn't have, right? But I identified the scratching sounds were coming from the doorknob or the lock. The sounds of when someone tries to insert a key or a card to unlock the door and get in. Except that this person clearly didn't have a key to my apartment. I kept getting closer to the door, only so that I could look through the peephole. And there was this old man, white beard and white hair, dressed in all black clothes with a couple of shopping bags sitting next to him, I think. Now, I don't think I've ever thought so rationally, or maybe irrationally, depending on how you see it, in my whole life so quickly. I've never been this brave, and I mean, what can a 5-foot girl do with zero self-defense knowledge, right? All I learned that day, though, was that, unfortunately for a small girl, my response was fight and not flight or freeze. I took a couple of steps back and ran to the door and kicked it as hard as I could, and I growled at him. You would think that he would run, right? But he didn't. He just picked up his bags, turned his back, and went downstairs. And that was terribly creepy. To make sure that I was safe, I reported it to the sheriff's office. The lady on the phone told me that he might be just an old man who was lost, but why my apartment, though? She told me that there were a couple of incidences of the same nature that were reported the previous week, though, so they may not be all coincidence. Then, to double check, I talk to my neighbours downstairs who have a clear sight of whoever gets up and comes down the stairs like that. And they hang outside their apartment a lot too, so I figured that they would know something. So when I confirmed with them, they said that they had actually seen this guy once on the opposite side of the apartments, but never sure if he actually lived here. I always wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, to be honest. I mean, he might just be old and lost, but what if he wasn't that way? It could all have just been a disguise. Plus, I'm the only single little girl who lived in that building. But I just can't stop thinking about how, if he meant harm that day, I probably dodged a massive bullet. So basically, me and my fiance went to my mate's dad's uncle's pub sort of restaurant thing and had a drink and something to eat. We left and it wasn't dark yet, so we went to these woods like 5 minutes away. We got there and my fiance just sort of froze. And she looked anxious and she sort of went white. I was fine, mind you. I just said, let's go for a quick walk before it gets dark. So we got out and started walking down the path. The path was literally a straight line with crossroads every so often. I was completely fine, but she was clearly anxious or paranoid about something and kept looking around and saying that she doesn't like it here. I started to freak out a little bit too, like, why is she doing this? We carried on walking and she asked if we could go back and she said that I have a bad feeling. We need to go, like now. I was just so confused, and it made me a little anxious, like I said, as she wouldn't tell me what was wrong. After like 10 seconds of walking, I look to my right, and I see a silhouette of what looks like an adult standing on the side of the path. No clothes, no facial features, and nothing really to resemble a human. I wasn't seeing things, though. I definitely saw it, and my heart sank, and you know that sort of cold, heart-wrenching feeling that you get sometimes? Well, I went pale and sort of cold. I couldn't stop shaking, in fact. Man, it was messed up. But we kept walking, and I was really paranoid. I kept looking behind us. We were getting close to the car now, and she was nearly in tears. I got into the car, though, and all of a sudden it just went pitch black outside, like it was bright, and then the next thing you know, it was completely dark. We drove out, and she said that I don't want to talk about it until I'm out of this area, so we drove out of the area, and then I said to her, did you see something? And she said yeah, and still looked completely pale. Then I said, I'll tell you what I saw first, so you know that I'm not BSing you. So I said what I saw, and she saw the exact same thing, but she allegedly saw it twice, and she described it exactly how, well, it looked. It was kind of like Slender Man vibes, to be honest. It was really messed up, whatever it was, and I've never experienced anything like this in my life. But it gets worse. So, when we got back to Crawley and parked up outside of her house, I parked facing a wall, so the back end of my car had space for people to walk behind it. We were talking about all of this, and we sort of forgot about it eventually. Then I just randomly looked at my windscreen mirror, and I swear to you that I saw someone walk really slowly behind the car. So I said to her, oh, there's someone behind the... But I couldn't finish my sentence as the person just vanished. I was looking in my wing mirror to see the person walk past, but no one ever popped up out the other side. I even got out and looked around, but there was nobody there. My heart sank so much at that point. I've never felt so petrified in my life. But then she saw someone walk next to the car, so I said, let's just get out of here. We drove out of the car park, and as soon as we did, we saw this woman walk out of a house holding a chest and staring at the sky, screaming as loud as she could. This is the first time that anything has happened to me like this, and I have so many questions because it was just a really random and confusing night. I still have no idea what any of this means, but if you do, then I would love to hear it.